Okay, welcome everybody to the Scintillating Science of Logic session number 5. We're going paragraph by paragraph so far in Hegel's text, his masterwork that is notoriously difficult to understand. In the last session, there was something controversial that I said, and it's the fact that Hegel claims to be exposing the mind of God before the created world in his Science of Logic. And so if you're an atheist in one of the metamodes, that might be shocking and a bit of a turnoff. But hold on, all the metamodes are going to be present, like we said before. So to compensate a little bit, because we went into the right Hegelian world a little bit, we're going to go into the left Hegelian world and show that's the same thing. That's what speculative thought is. It is showing opposites at the same time in the right way. And that word wakefulness is very important in Hegel. In fact, logic is wakefulness. Right? You can't see logic anywhere, but it's in everything. But the modern secular understanding of it in terms of atheism or secularism is that it is a science, a logic. So how do we justify this claim of giving divine knowledge? You're learning to think divinely. You're learning the logic of God directly. So you are becoming divine through these readings. And it is an incredibly profound experience because we're not doing it in a dogmatic, what's called an external way. We're doing it internally to your own cognition, that these conditions of infinite science, of objective truth, are in your mind. Even though it can mess things up, Hegel gets you out of that and gets you into a state where you can know the truth. So I want to say that in terms of left Hegelianism, this is not a God that is beyond. So left Hegelianism or secularism or atheists who might be reading this, the thing that they fear about the right Hegelian interpretation is that God is beyond and you can't know it as a finite human being, which means that you're bad, you're sinful forever, original sin, all these types of things is really what atheists or secularists or scientists are resisting, right? You don't like that. So how Hegel brings the worlds together in a way that satisfies both of them is that God is this infinite objective being, but is also something that you can now know for yourself directly, meaning that if you're a secularist, it's apotheosis, meaning that you are becoming godly here on earth. But in terms of right Hegelianism, it's theosis, not just apotheosis, which means you're becoming divine through something objectively true in itself. It's just that you're already connected to it, and you can think in that way and have that kind of power in the right wakefulness, which will come off as a logic that just makes sense. And a whole heck of a lot of sense. In fact, an eternity of fractal holonic completeness that is currently missing in the way we teach logic today. The logic we teach today is a fragmented, broken version of what Hegel is teaching in speculative dialectical thought. This is the profound thinking of these worlds coming together. So if you don't believe, if you're a right Hegelian, you're thinking, no, you've gone too far, you're going way too left Hegelian, no, you're a left Hegelian, you're a wolf in sheep's clothing, you're trying to pretend to be a right Hegelian as well, no, that's not actually, it's not just me saying this. There is actually a lot of truth to this perspective in Hegel's own words. And we're going to show that through this Garden of Eden example that Hegel's talked about. And then we're going to get into the paragraph, right? So here's some Garden of Eden imagery. Let's put this up to the side. There's the tree of knowledge there. And if you read the lesser logic, and the lesser logic is I would say, the lesser logic is Hegel's interpretation of the science of logic for high school students. And I'm just trying to pull up, there's a little bit of a glitch here. I'm just trying to pull up a quote that he has about the Garden of Eden while he's trying to go through the logic. But it's in his lesser logic, and we're covering the greater logic. So you should see on the screen his lesser logic now. Perfect, there it is. And I'm going to highlight here his interpretation of this famous story from the Bible, the Christian Bible. So as we know in the Garden of Eden, the two stars of the show, Adam and Eve, are there pure, and they eat from this tree of knowledge, and they have the fall, and this is where they start sinning, or sin becomes their defining characteristic as original sin. But Hegel says that's not where the story ends. He says the story does not close with the expulsion from paradise, which is what the fall was about. We are further told, God said, behold, Adam is become as one of us, to know good and evil. Knowledge is now spoken of as divine. This is where the left Hegelians will raise their hands and say, oh, thankfully, we are not beholden to this thing we have to be fearful, the fear of God, God-fearing. Hegel says the fear, well, even the Bible says this, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, but Hegel says it's only the beginning. There's actually more to the story. And we're showing that more to the story here in this Hegel's interpretation that the story of the Garden of Eden is a circle. All divine truth works in circles because they're absolute, and absolutes can't ground themselves on anything other than themselves. So they don't have a loose end. Their end circles back to its beginning again. Okay, so that's how we should interpret the Garden of Eden, is that knowledge is originally thought of as evil because they ate from the tree of knowledge and they began to learn good and evil, which is a dialectic. It's a dualism. And when you're in dualistic consciousness, you break that circle and you linearize things. But we're not doing that here. Hegel's returning us to a type of thinking that is divine. But it's also scientific because it's a systematic, self-consistent, self-grounding, principled way of wakefulness, I guess you could say. And that's just logic. Okay, so we return. Yes, we have the fall. We learn this dualistic thinking. At first we do things wrong, but then our thought purifies. There's like a halfway point. It purifies and it comes back around and we return to the Garden of Eden on earth in the right wakefulness. Kingdom come, you could say, if you're a right Hegelian. And if you're a left Hegelian, you can just say it's true science. We complete the contradictions. We completely understand science that the contradictions resolve. Okay, so this is why knowledge, thinking, is not shunned. It's embraced as spirit. Spirit is wakeful thinking from the soul. Right? The true being of nature is metaphysics. Nature's nature is the science of logic in its self-grounding form. True objectivity. So whether you're right or left Hegelian, it empowers you. And your fear of the Lord becomes a love of the Lord or the love of God through spirit. Or if you're a scientist, you can just say that that inner system in your head that we think is our human logic is actually a system immanent in nature itself that we're rediscovering as our conditions of true cognition. Okay, and we're rebuilding ourselves. We have fragments of correctness that we're bringing into a comprehensive whole. And when you bring something into a comprehensive whole, that's what truth is, not merely correctness. All right, so this is from the science of logic, the lesser logic. And now we'll get into the greater logic. I just wanted to clarify that so that our left Hegelians weren't left behind. But we're doing it all here. This is the true Hegel. All right? And we'll get into paragraph number 5 now of the actual science of logic, the greater logic at the moment. Let's see if I can pull this up. Nope. Interesting. Oh, okay, I see. Thank you for your patience as I work with these bugs. Let's bring up our metamode interpretation. So the reason why we're doing metamodes is to show that we are doing it all. If my sound is coming through. Oh, I see. Okay, so we're going to begin with Hegel talking about this metaphysics and how the history of philosophy, the current history of philosophy in the 1800s, there's something wrong with it. At least that's what he's saying. So let me highlight. Oh. Okay, so hopefully this is my copy. So he says, paragraph number 5 of the greater logic, the science of logic. Nevertheless, he says, wow, it's really choppy here. Nevertheless, probably for the sake of a certain formal utility, it was left a place amongst the sciences. And when he means it, he means logic. And indeed, was even retained as a subject of public instruction. However, this better lot concerns only the outer fate of logic, for its structure and contents have remained the same throughout long inherited tradition, although in the course of being passed on, the contents have become ever more diluted and attenuated. Logic shows no traces so far of the new spirit which has arisen in the sciences, no less in the world of actuality. However, Once the substantial form of the spirit has inwardly reconstituted itself, all attempts to preserve the forms of an earlier culture are utterly in vain. Like withered leaves, they are pushed off by the new buds already growing at their roots. So let's do the high-level summary first before we get into the technical, for those that just want a quick summary. What Hegel is saying here is that logic is not suffering the exact same fate as metaphysics in the 1800s. This is roughly 1812 when Hegel published this, Science of Logic. He's saying that metaphysics was, in some sense, destroyed or not studied. It's so destroyed in a sense, or disrespected, that it's not even taught in public schools anymore. It's not a practical science. And logic, in the previous paragraph, had a prejudice against it, that it taught you how to think, but in some sense it taught you how to think even though you're already thinking. So why do you need to learn to think when you're already thinking? It seems like a useless science. So then why is it still around? Hegel is saying here, there seems to be a formal utility. There's something useful about it that is being preserved, even when the modern scientists, after the French Revolution, the modernists, the modern age was beginning, you could say, and they didn't really see as much practicality in it. So by some kind of fluke, it's remained in public schools being taught, and it's sort of like a way, it's like withered leaves. It's like an old science that's withering, but there's new buds, he's saying, that are being pushed off, that are going to revive it. And that's why it's still relevant, is that there is something to this that is highly practical. We're just doing it in the wrong way. That's what this paragraph is saying. So that's the high-level summary. Now, if you want to skip to the next paragraph, watch the next video, but this is where it gets a little bit more in depth. It might seem pedantic to people that aren't realizing how much confusion, how much competition there is around trying to understand this stuff. So we're going to be coming clear by showing first the external reading of the text. So the external reading is what ordinary consciousness does to read in reading the words, and misses the true meaning of what Hegel has. This comes down to what does the words mean, really? And we have an external mode of understanding it, which is going to sound a lot like abstract science in these first few sentences. It says, nevertheless, probably for the sake of a certain formal utility, it was still left a place among the sciences. So when we mean sciences here, we mean those modern kind of atheistic secular sciences that's very empirical, and was even retained as a subject of public instruction. Right, and at this time it's really separating church from state. It's really trying to get the superstition of religion out of there. However, this better law concerns only the outer fate of logic. So remember, outer fate is what he's referencing as external, right? He's pointing to an external consciousness, an external way of interpreting things, which is in some sense incorrect or disordered. For structure and contents have remained the same throughout a long-inherited tradition. So it's not the true usefulness of logic that's being preserved, because we don't know what we're doing. They know not what they do, if you're a right Hegelian, thinking about this from a Christian perspective. Although in the course of being passed on, the contents become ever more diluted and attenuated. So I want to say that everything up until this point is going to appeal to the metamode of the abstract scientist. This is like our modern scientists, right? Our atheists or secularists. This is all about science. They're happy with seeing the science words. Okay, logic is at least not superstition. It has utility. There's some practicality here, which harkens to empiricism. And even though it's a long inherited tradition, at least it came from Aristotle, who was an empiricist. So this is all external consciousness looking like abstract science. And it seems like it's in some sense vindicating it. Then he goes on to say, logic shows no traces so far, and this is where we get the change. So far of, and now we seem to be getting into religion, of the new spirit which has arisen. And at least in Christianity, that's a pretty powerful reference to Jesus rising up, or this spontaneous kind of emergence, this non-linear way of the sciences. So spirit, of course, is interpreted knower and modern science. That's an old term. But then we get this weird twisting again. In the sciences, he says, no less than in the world of actuality. So a lot of this stuff really sounds a lot like science again. New science is actually. However, yeah, so this is abstract science. However, once the substantial form of the spirit has inwardly reconstituted itself, so it seems like he's returning back to this religious kind of perspective. So you're starting to get that twisty-turny feeling. The substantial form of the spirit has inwardly reconstituted itself. All attempts to preserve the forms of an earlier culture are utterly in vain. And that culture, of course, is religious. So this is where our religious individuals will feel like they're being heard, or at least acknowledged. And he says, like withered leaves, they are pushed off off by the new buds already growing at their roots. So this is very sensuous, very much in our five senses, which sounds a lot like art. So this is how external consciousness wants to read this paragraph. But is this really the right way? Well, it seems really confusing that he's switching between all these modes that are usually in contradiction, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to show actually, in terms of the internal mode of reading this, he means something different. And it makes more sense the way that we're going to highlight it now in terms of the metamodes that he's actually meaning or hearkening towards. And I'll explain again each sentence of why. So the first couple of sentences seems like abstract science because of logic. He says, nevertheless, probably for the sake of a certain formal utility, it still left a place among the sciences, and indeed was even retained as a subject of public instruction. This is actually abstract philosophy, because he's talking about logic as how Aristotle meant it back in the 2500, 2600 years ago. And he's saying that it's surprising that this ancient philosophical version of logic survived at all, because in his mind, in the true Hegel, he's actually equating with metaphysics. Logic actually is what we call metaphysics. But metaphysics, because it was separated from logic, became this mystical kind of realm of forms, superstitious thing, because when the human mind isn't aligned with the structure of truth, it fills that structure of truth with a bunch of superstitions, a bunch of what's called contingent logic, or logic that is based on our opinions of things. So he's saying here, the reason why it's surprising that logic survived is because it came from a long time ago when things were still very mystical. And even ancient Greece, where Aristotle came from, the state was run by mythology. Greek mythology is quite famous. So that's why we're going to make this not abstract science. He's actually talking about logic in that sort of more metaphysical form, or in that Aristotelian form, which looks like it's empirical. But another layer of confusion in this is that Aristotle is seen as a one-sided modern scientist, not a Platonic scientist with his realm of forms, this made-up stuff. But actually, Hegel says Aristotle was the sublation of Plato, meaning that he was not the abstract negation, he was the inclusion of Plato. And so his empiricism is really defining the realm of forms. He's creating a system that is metaphysically consistent, which is why metaphysics, I think he was the one that named metaphysics for the first time. And it's the physics of physics. It's this logic that underpins, this pattern that underpins all the true developments of nature. But we need to think of Aristotle, at least for Hegel, as a metaphysician, where his logic is empirical and in the realm of forms, a priori. So let's go on. It says, the true Hegel means, however, this better lot concerns only the outer fate of logic, right? Not the true heart of logic, for its structure and contents have remained the same throughout a long inherited tradition. So this tradition is, of course, the Aristotelian tradition, where even the scholastics, even the religious, especially after Rome, they kind of shunned it, but Thomas Aquinas came back and tried to revive it. And then the Persians really, Avicenna and the rest of them, they really got into trying to delve into how do you extend Aristotle's tradition, because Aristotle didn't approach logic from its outer fate. He approached it from its inner destiny. Aristotle did it the right way, but it was in fragmented form, Hegel said. So this is the tradition he's referencing here. Although in the course of being passed on, the contents have become ever more diluted and attenuated. Right, so what does he mean here? He means that nobody's really added anything substantial to Aristotle's version of the logic with the syllogism and all of this in thousands and thousands of years, like 2,500 years. Nothing has substantially changed. Hegel says they made little refinements and little adjustments, but nothing to the core, the essence of what logic is true. It is in its destiny. There's like a fate to it where it's dying slowly over time because it's not a living logic. And Aristotle had a living logic. So we're going to highlight this as abstract philosophy because that's really how Hegel's meaning this logic. He doesn't mean it in the total logical way that we mean it today, right? Which is like analytical logic. Okay, so then he goes on, logic shows no traces so far. Oh, so what I want to do here too is I want to show that yes, it's meant for the abstract philosopher, but we're going to change the font as well because he's meaning logic in its true form, in its living form, which is genuine philosophy. So this might be a little hard to read, but bear with me. You've already read the paragraph 3 times with me. This is like abstract philosophy as abstract philosophers kind of see it, and this is abstract philosopher as someone with genuine wisdom or speculative thought sees it. That we know the difference between the dead form of teaching Aristotle and the true form of Aristotle, even though he died thousands of years ago, and most of his writings have been lost. We only have fragments left. Because Hegel has the universal logic, the true logic, he's able to rebuild the past in this higher spirit of inwardness. Despite the external appearances of things, he grasps the essence of things because he knows the right wayfulness. And he can trace it back in a much more profound way of comprehension, not just repetition or paraphrasing. Okay, so that's why we're going to highlight that in that kind of hard to read way. Okay, so the next thing he says is logic shows no traces so far of the new spirit. And so now what we want to show is this is the part where he is appealing to abstract scientists. He's saying that the way that they're using the logic is kind of in this dead way that's not even showing the old Aristotle properly, right? So this new spirit, and of course here he means new spirit as this revolution that was occurring in philosophy and the sciences in the 1800s. This new spirit he does mean in a semi-religious way that harkens to what Aristotle was doing in that inner truth of the living logic. And of course Christianity talks about the truth, the life, and the way. You know, eternal life is really just this logic, and it's moving in this powerful way that's self-generating. And Hegel, is coming at the end of Fichte, Schelling, after Kant. He's coming in and he's saying that actually we need to return to what religion and Aristotle were doing in their real interpretation, which does get into this mystical sort of right Hegelianism. But he's doing it in abstract scientific form. He's saying, no, this is a system that doesn't have superstition in it. That's why he's going back to sciences. No less than, and here's where we're going to make another transition in terms of highlighting. We're going to call this genuine philosophy because this does have to do with secular science. But then he says something strange. He says, no less than in the world of actuality. So this is really going to be difficult for even Hegelian scholars to understand, because here's where we're getting into pure genuine philosophy again, the real stuff. And it's really difficult to get into this because you have to have the right context, the universal context, which we're trying to show here by contrasting the Metamodes. No less than in the world of actuality. Right? Logic shows no traces so far of the new spirit which has arisen in the sciences, no less than in the world of actuality. The world of actuality is the world where the metaphysics and empiricism come together as one. That you're seeing the divine truth in the nature of nature. That what we're witnessing as the laws of the universe are really these metaphysical laws that are already inside of us. But our cognition, the conditions of realizing that inner spirit, that new spirit, are in some ways broken or weakened, especially by this attenuated and dilutedness that's happened to this wakefulness. It's been diluted, right? So it's even harder to get into it when you're an abstract scientist. An abstract scientist has this outer fate to it, right? Okay, I might be belaboring this point, but this is the hard stuff. So we're getting into actuality as the unity of the inner and the outer. That's what Hegel calls actuality in the first place. You'll see it in his Doctrine of Essence. That's why he puts it there. So then we're going to go into, however, sorry, this is a little bit slow because my systems are all out of whack. Thank you, Heavier, for your patience. It says, however, once the substantial form of the spirit has inwardly reconstituted itself, all attempts at preserving the forms of an earlier culture are utterly in vain. So preserve the forms, and when he means forms, he means, of course, the logic, the categories. Form and categories are very close to the same in Hegel. Pure form is in the metaphysical transcendental world. And that's why Thomas Aquinas and these other right Hegelians were calling it pure form, and they're playing around with those words because they're absolute words. But Hegel's meaning them in the way that Plato and Aristotle were using them. And they were using them more consciously than Socrates. Even though Socrates was a master, he was channeling this inner oracle. It didn't quite fully understand what he was doing. He in some sense understood, but he didn't understand it in a systematic way, which turned it into a science. That's where Plato comes in. So of an earlier culture are utterly in vain, like withered leaves, they are pushed off. So this is culture here. Hegel doesn't just mean religious, he means all of them, and it kind of comes off as artistic because culture is a very linguistic, natural emergence. You know, when human beings come together, they just automatically form a culture. So Hegel really means culture, even in terms of law. Culture is a kind of loose form of law, and that's why it's not very structured. So these earlier cultures weren't as structured as what modern science or the modern science of that time was trying to do. But compared to the living logic, the current abstract scientists are not in genuine wisdom. They too are in this kind of loose culture, even though it's getting tighter and tighter in terms of the actual structure. These new buds already growing from their roots. Real living logic is like a plant in a way. It starts from a seed and then it evolves, it grows, just like the universe grows from physics to chemistry to biology, plants, animals, humans. The reason why the universe is evolving that way is because it's actually following the metaphysics. It's not the other way around. Even though it's a circle and the empirical world returns back to that a priori world, it's actually, in terms of real logic, that's presuppositionless, like self-grounding. It has to start with the metaphysics because the difference between nature and structure in the first place has to be defined. And dialectical materialism, if you're a Marxist, or in terms of abstract science or secular science, they just stop at the Big Bang and they say, well, where does the structure for all the particles come from? Why is there time at all? Why isn't there just one big soup of like craziness where there's no meaning at all? Why is there meaning in the first place? How can we discern things with our consciousness? Where does that organizing principle come from? Even if it's a random organizing principle of human will, where does our random human will come from? That question will forever remain unanswered if you don't understand the true metaphysical form of logic as self-grounding system. When we say metaphysical, though, we don't mean superstitious, which the left Hegelians will cringe at. And you're right to be cringing in a way because Hegel also cringed at that. He said mysticism, speculative thought, is a rational mysticism that just lays outside of the current understanding of consciousness. It doesn't mean it can't understand it, like the scholastics of the past made God beyond God-fearing. No, you're allowed to know immanently, sort of like a Protestant, there's a direct connection. And Protestantism, with Martin Luther, was the first step towards science because it made you responsible for making a direct connection to the truth. All right, so we're going to be bringing back Protestantism and Catholicism together, and then uniting that with science, and then uniting that with all forms of truth as one universal logic. This is the science of logic in its truth, and hopefully with this paragraph you see how Hegel really means these words in their internal meaning, in their actual meaning, rather than just in that external outer fate which kills the logic, kills the life of things, kills the meanings, and makes life an insipid, mundane existence, when in truth, the absolute is always present because we are the absolute, and our consciousness is this logic in nature, and in the nature of nature, and in the nature of our true selves. Okay, I hope you found that useful. Thank you very much. If you're interested in the next sessions, there's a private session now, as you heard from the last session. There's this golden ticket that you can get if you're willing to do a little bit of work in a practical, in a praxis. We're going to make this logic actual on earth. If you're a right Hegelian, it's kingdom come. If you're a left Hegelian, we're completing the theory of everything in a self-comprehending system, which we can grasp as humans, right? So we don't have to be always in this God-fearing. We can be in spirit-loving, a higher spirit of science, this destiny. But now we actually are going to introduce one more thing. We're going to be introducing not just the golden ticket, but there's now a higher session that I'm putting together that really gets to the core of the incredibleness of what Hegel is really trying to do. This is a little bit difficult for me. I'm trying to pull these up here, but my computer's slow. So if you want to give any funds that can help me buy something that can run this setup a little better, you're more than welcome. But I enjoy giving this for free, and in the end, these other sessions will be given away for free too in the next couple of months. It's just to try and encourage people to get into the practical side, that this is not just logic in your head, this is to change your beingness in the world. Okay, so am I able to pull this up? Can you see the golden ticket? Well, hopefully you can kind of see it. I don't think it's going to come up. Anyway, there's also a Holy Grail version of this now, and it's the Holy Grail of Hegel, where there's an inner structure to the living logic that's quite simple, and it's repeating over and over and over and over in every single movement of Hegel's words, and even the paragraph we just read. But if I showed it too quickly at first, external consciousness wants to attach to the sensuous forms, and it'll attach to what's called the quantitative form of it rather than the qualitative form, and you'll miss the meaning. So I want to build up a little bit to that, so that it will make sense, and ordinary consciousness won't just graze over it. Okay. I appreciate you guys. Thank you. I'm tempted to want to show this next. There it is. Okay, so it is. I got the wrong window up. Okay, so that's the Holy Grail license. Not the best design, but it's not the worst design either. So this is the golden ticket for the next sessions. All you have to do is go over the wisdom quiz, vow of abandonment, and spirit license. You don't have to sign on to any of these things. You just got to attempt them, and then it gives you these 20 free sessions behind the scenes. And then if you really want to go deep, then the Holy Grail is you take the vow of abandonment at the lowest level, level 5, which is easy. And then you sign the spirit license, but it has to be perfect for you. So you actually have to understand it and realize that there's a reciprocity to this higher spirit of thinking. Spirit is a return. It's a return to truth. And you can do that in economics. You can do that in politics, just like Marx was trying to do. That's why he was trying to do all of that. He was using the living logic, even though he's calling it dialectical materialism, and left it unjustified, which is actually an unscientific move. So ironically, the dialectic twists you into your opposite when you're ignorant of the full circle of truth, that absolute truth. And so Marx rotated the circle, didn't say Hegel was wrong, called him the master actually, but nobody ever questioned where did he get this, how did he learn to write his Das Kapital in this really weird way. It's kind of mystical, it's moving by some kind of logic that nobody can seem to understand, and it's because you need to know Hegel first. And that's why Marx gives him a lot of credit. Marx wasn't quite as good as Hegel, that's why he didn't finish communism, and that's why it too was twisted into its opposite in some ways. And so we're going to correct that, whether you're capitalist, socialist, or communist. We're going to come with that right wakefulness in the right order of things, and then they'll make sense as belonging together. That's what the New World spirit is, and you can start getting into that practical spirit in that practical way to this Holy Grail. But thank you for coming to this session. This session is, of course, the beginning, and hopefully you're starting to recognize the internal and external understandings and why there's so much confusion in Hegel. It's not gibberish. It really is the mind of God. It is your mind in its truth. If you're an existentialist, that's why you can create meaning in the first place and rise up to your Übermensch. Whether you call it absolute spirit or you call it the Übermensch or the power of the human spirit, it's the same logic in different forms. and we're showing the living version of it in any form as Hegel truly meant it in its inner notion and beauty. Okay, until next time, take care, stay compassionate, and keep scintillating. Peace. Oh.